Gosh, what a lot of people. I've never talked to as many people before. The first thing to do is to make sure you can all hear me and that this isn't too loud or that there aren't any complaints about the noise. Right. Okay, second thing to do is to turn this off. Oh, bother, that wasn't, oh, yeah. That was a bad start. I just thought. There we are. That's what's meant. Well, they blow past us like straws in the wind. We hear about the energy problem, and we hear about the climate problem, and the water problem, and the soil problem, and the fish problem, and the acidic oceans problem, and the decline of religions, and the decline of social cohesion, and the decline of social capital. Well, what are we to make of this? Well, there are two things that we could possibly make of it. One is a very dark view indeed about how these problems won't be solved in terms which will leave our society in anything like the condition we're used to. And the other view is that if we do a lot of the right things very quickly, then we will be able to save ourselves from the worst consequences. I take the first view, what is normally regarded as the pessimistic view, but I think it's absolutely right, particularly this evening, since we're very privileged to have with us Lord Oxborough, who is teaching at Dartington, as a former chairman of Shell, to say that there is another view. And broadly speaking, though he is more than capable of speaking for himself, he takes the more optimistic view. So do bear in mind that whatever I say, there is only one view of the matter, and that Lord Oxborough may want some sort of right of reply or some corrective at the end. Having said that, I personally have no doubt about the situation that we're in, and in many ways it's not a good situation. In fact, in most ways it's not a good situation. The only way in which it is a good situation is that it has been seen before, and that this is the normal way that the life cycle of a large civic society works out. They don't have just one problem, they have many, all coming at them at the same time. And they realize that problem after problem overwhelms them, and the civic society dies. And as it dies, it breaks up. There is a very sharp decline in population. And as in the case, as some of you may have been there last night when we were talking about this, there is a decline in technology along to a situation which is much worse than the situation from which it began. And in the case of the last time it happened in Britain, we have to remember that this is a cyclical event, which has happened something like 25 times before in the history of the world. The last time it happened in Britain, it was in the case of the Romans, and they arrived in Britain to find a thriving Celtic society in the High Iron Age, quite well developed, with good tools, good farming equipment, ability to make pots and to make roof tiles. And when they left, society crashed, the population was cut down, as the Venerable Bede said, like ripe corn. And many of their technologies declined. And one technology which I will show you a quick picture of, and I haven't got many quick pictures to show you, but I think is particularly telling, is of some cows. I'm going to move it. And there we see, except I can't see them, there we see there are three cows. Number one is a Celtic cow. And as you see, this has been measured by archaeologists. You may wonder how it comes about that archaeologists have managed to measure a Celtic cow. But they have, in fact, many, many times. Apparently, Celtic cows and all other cows leave remains for archaeologists to measure in future generations. And true to their kind, the Celtic cow was left clear evidence that your average Celtic cow was 115.5 millimeters tall. Okay, and then along came the more advanced Roman civilization. And the average cow there was a quite obviously heftier looking beast with a bigger bottom and higher, fiercer looking cow, 120 millimeters tall. And then the Romans went from the early medieval was a sort of 6th century cow. That's a 6th century cow, which is 112 millimeters tall. Clearly not only sort of substantially less tall, but clearly a smaller, lighter beast for a smaller, lighter, sort of leaner early medieval society. Right. Well, it seems that the story, what history is telling us, is that in the last sort of 20,000 years or so, 15,000 years of history, there has been a very sort of positive sort of undertow, a sort of Barkian ground base of human settlements. That is to say, people living in rural villages, carrying on, inventing religions, inventing dairy systems, inventing agriculture. And from time to time, something absolutely dramatic happens, and up pops a big civic society and produces cathedrals and pyramids and absolutely astonishing things, and invents emperors and judges and writes books and plays. And then it has this glorious sort of 4 or 5 centuries, sometimes substantially longer, of civic life. And then, like a flower, it dies, and the life goes back to a sort of normal, the ground base of rural villages. I think that's what's happening at the moment, except I think there is one wrinkle which hasn't happened before, and that is that our civic society is not only a civic society that's like sort of popped back into sort of oblivion like the previous ones have, but in our case, ours is a global one, so that any damage it causes is not going to be sort of left with traces of deserts in various parts of the world, which we can explore and send archaeologists to explore. But it actually is something which could actually turn the whole world into a desert. That's one problem. Another problem which is related to it is that it's harder actually to put your finger on any part of our society which in fact isn't part of the civic society. So the idea that one could go back to the decentralized rural villages and able to pick up the pieces and carry on for the next 1,000 years until someone develops a new way of doing it is beginning to look a little bit odd. Maybe what we really ought to be thinking about, above all, is protecting and rescuing and preserving and ensuring the survival of that ground base of rural villages. Are there any really rural villages left in England? One does wonder. Or are they just outposts of towns, driving urban cars and using urban energy systems and eating urban food and going on urban holidays and earning urban incomes? Well, I leave it to you to judge. I'm looking rather as though we are a globally urban society. What I would like to suggest that what we ought to concentrate on above all is localization in the full sense of the word, rediscovering the rural locality. It seems to me that is the urgent thing for us to do. There are many people determined to protect gene pools of various plants. What we have to do is to protect the gene pool of human society, and that is what is endangered, in my view. Right, I'm now going to turn to a positive and more uplifting sort of stage of my talk by saying that there are many things we can do, and even though Lord Oxburgh and I may disagree in a very friendly way on a number of topics, we can probably agree on many of the solutions, which is a good thing, but I don't like agreement to be taken too far. Fundamentally, we do disagree. Let me assure you that. Well, it seems to me that if one puts all these straws in the wind, catches some of them and sort of lays them out on one's sort of desk and examines them, they have a number of qualities in common. And one of the qualities they're in common is that they are all in some way related to energy. They're all related in a lot of other ways as well, but one can only do one thing at a time, and let's actually say they are all related to energy. Then one can ask oneself whether it might be possible, possibly, to think of it a little bit like a cat's cradle. I seem to remember in the mists of time, when I was about 3, some of my sort of elder women acquaintances used to make cat's cradles, which I couldn't. And they showed, I don't know whether this ever happened to any of you, but anyway, it certainly did happen to me, unless I dreamt it. Anyway, they held the cat's cradle in one hand, and they pulled the string with the other, and it sort of closed up, I seem to remember. Does that ring any bells with you? It does, right, yeah, okay, right. So all you have to do is just pull one string, and all these other bits sort of close up. So I always thought that I have a sort of long-term memory for a lot of things like that. They sort of stuck in my mind, and I've never been able to make one. But now there's a theory which, well, I'm making up for it now by saying, well, let's just use it as a metaphor. Since I can't actually make one myself, let's actually use this for what the story might tell us. Well, that story is a story about energy, and there are some things one can do about energy. And if one gets energy right, then a lot of other things will come right too. Well, I think the way to get energy right is to put all energy under sort of a very, very clear, very simple four-part plan. And I think it's only fair to call it lean energy, because I think it's a jolly good name, and everything I do is lean. So lean energy is what it's called. And the four-part plan, part number one is this is part one is fairly conventional stuff. You'll have heard this about 25 times before, if not 25,000. First thing, we ought to apply very quickly all the conservation technologies which are available, and they are actually awash with possibilities and in prototypes of conservation systems that do wonderful things, which make it possible to live in a cold climate in a house without any use of fossil fuels. Indeed, from time to time, even to export energy. People are inventing cars that can go long distances on a fraction of the fuel, and much of that fuel is generated by solar energy. And there are many other systems. In engineering, there are lots of ways in which one can run a factory without using a lot of energy from the national grid by rethinking the way one's heating pipes and one's pumps and one's machinery, and thinking about the production technology in fundamentally different ways. And there's lots of rhetoric one can produce about this, and lots of the rhetoric is actually true. And if you want to know any more detail about this, I recommend you should read a book called Natural Capitalism by Paul Hawken and Nicholas and Amory Lovins and Hunter Lovins. And some of it, actually, that is hyperbole, because they seem to assume that the supplies of gas are going to be almost unlimited, and the only task for oil in the future of any significance is going to be to hold the ground up, I quote. Nonetheless, everybody is entitled to a certain amount of insanity, and their insanity is fairly harmless, and insanity goes. So if any of you want to know about the technology, the conservation technologies, then do read that book. There are probably other even better books, but nonetheless, it's good fun reading that book. Now, there's a second thing one should do is not at all like that. You probably won't have heard it 25 times before. You may not have heard it at all, but you may have. You never know, which is really developing something called structural change, which is in fact almost incomprehensible as I describe it, but the proximity principle is a little bit more clear. And if there is a disagreement about solutions between, I won't mention the gentleman more than once or twice more, but Lord Oxborough and me, it may well be that he is not giving the same emphasis to structural change as I am, and that is the essential difference that would come in the solutions we're talking about. By structural change, by proximity principle, I'm talking about an absolutely radical rethink of the whole of the way we run our political economy, our whole use of land, our whole use of transport, the way we grow food, the way we import, the way we spend our time, the way we do absolutely everything. Imagine a society without transport. Well, I think such a society would have various qualities. One, that it would be absolutely wonderful. The other thing, it's absolutely likely, because it seems to me that the oil peak is going to come very quickly and very abruptly and very untidily and very soon. Because as the oil market changes, it'll change from being a buyer's market, nice and easily controlled buyer's market, that is to say, not controlled by a buyer's market, smoothly self-regulating with 6 billion buyers around the world, to being a seller's market with six tough guys in control, each one of which will be living a wonderful life with their Cadillacs and so on for the 6 months that they survive before they're shot by their brother, and then exports from that country will close down and we'll be without oil. I kid you not, because that's what happens when markets break down. Markets are smoothly running. It's called the law of large numbers. One of the fundamental things of statistics as applied to economics. You have lots and lots of people involved in a system, and the system runs smoothly. And that is what isn't going to happen, because round about 2009, 2010, thereabouts, nobody knows when the oil peak is going to happen, but they know it is going to happen. We're going to change from a smooth buyer's market to a very unsmooth seller's market. When that happens, transport will begin to cough. If we ever run out of petrol, which I have from time to time in the days when I used to drive a car, it doesn't run out of petrol smoothly, it runs out, it coughs, and you think a car seems to have got a cold, and then it stops. And that's what's going to happen. There will be periods of 2 or 3 weeks during which we don't have enough fuel, and then it'll come back again. The government will say, that's okay, our clever international negotiations restored the energy, aren't we clever? And you'll be driving around, and then another sort of 3 months will go by, and then it'll be a 4-week outage, it'll be a deeper outage. And those outages will get deeper and deeper until eventually it actually does break down. So it's very likely we will be without transport. And we have to think now about what a society without transport would be. Anyway, the proximity principle, in summary, means producing things and making things in the same place as they are actually going to be used. Probably all I need to say about that. You can imagine how fundamental this would be. And I do think, actually, we need to recognize, I think this is a slight diversion, I think you need to recognize how wonderful it would be without transport if we actually think of the values of English poetry and English society and English life. Much of it actually is about the pleasure of actually being in one place. May she be like some green laurel rooted in one dear perpetual place, as W.B. Yeats said in that prayer. Wonderful, wonderful poem, which I'm sure you've got in your anthology, is a prayer for my daughter. All the values I ever need, all put together in one book. And Ben Jonson on Penshurst House, that wonderful poem, and Marvel on Appleton, and that house, a great Tew, where all the thinking that produced ended up with the turmoil of the Civil War came from. All the great things that have happened in English society have happened very much. They've happened at home. We're a very much home-based society. So we will be becoming a home-based society, whether we like it or not. Let's make sure we prepare for it. Anyway, that's the second thing we need to do on energy. That's the proximity principle. That's a difficult thing. That is the fundamental change. When the society which would exist after that had happened would be not recognizable relative to the society we have at the moment. And the third thing one needs to do, but only after those things have been done, either done or thought through in detail, then and only then should we start thinking about renewables. The idea of thinking about renewables before that's happened is absurd. And the reason we do this is because there are various top-down bureaucratic instructions, such as the non-fossil fuel obligation, which require the government to apply certain criteria, which involves them building wind turbines in various places and attaching to the national grid, which is going to be in deep trouble. So when the national grid gets into deep trouble in that it can't import the gas it needs to run, then it'll close down, and it will no longer be able to even to accept the energy produced by the turbines. If you've got a system which is in trouble, what you don't do is attach your backup system to the system that's in trouble. You have a parallel system, and you think about it in a completely fresh way. We need to think about renewables in a completely fresh way, and only after we've thought about conservation and structural change. That is the first 3 legs of energy policy. That's really all you need to know about energy policy, actually. Just think about it for a second while I have a drink. Well, there is one more thing we need to know about energy policy, I think, I would suggest, and that is that it's quite difficult to get there. And what we need to get there is actually to involve the people. We, the people, need to be involved. And we shouldn't be told what to do by people who think they know. We need to have a system which gets us involved and gives us an incentive to be involved in an entirely intelligent way. Well, the good news, I have to say, that there is such a system, and it's called tradable energy quotas. And I would like to tell you very briefly about tradable energy quotas, not what I'm here for, but I will tell you about them very, very briefly. How do I begin? Well, maybe I should just begin by saying what was bugging me over this curry. The usual things that bug me over curry is that a lot of people have been talking for a long, long time about the case for taxes, for various forms of carbon tax, and I think that's a bad idea for a lot of reasons. I mean, reasons such as you have a tax which is effective enough to affect the rich, then is going to absolutely destroy the poor. I mean, things like that. And in the future, given the sort of things that are going to happen to us, we're not going to be a rich society, and therefore, if we apply a heavy carbon tax, then there'll be many people who can't afford it at all. We're actually going to be a cash-strapped society, so an additional tax that makes us even more cash-strapped is not a good idea. And there are lots of other reasons, and let's go into the other reasons. They're really too obvious when it starts to intelligence. So what one needs is a system, a rationing system, like the systems I remember when I was but a lad during the war, but better, because we have electronics now, and coupons used to fall behind the piano, so it meant that we were out of bread for a week. So it actually makes more sense to have it electronic, and it really, I mean, someone had to think about how to work an electronic rationing system, because we're going to need one anyway, because when the oil and gas outages come, we'll need a way of rationing. It's probable the government has got supplies of ration books stacked up in a warehouse in Virginia Water, and they're probably sending next Monday they'll send a civil servant down to dust them down. But you know, there are better ways of doing it, and TEQs is a better way of doing it. TEQs is a short word for tradable energy quotas, as maybe some of you already know. Anyway, I'll just explain how they work very quickly, but many of you know. They are a very simple system in that the total amount of energy in the economy is divided initially, but not later, as you'll see, into the two sort of groups. One is all the energy that's used by individuals, and the other is all the energy that's used by absolutely everybody else, the government and every other energy user. And at the moment, that split is around about 40-60. And 40% of all energy, about 100% of all the energy is divided up into coupons, rather, actually one should say units, and that 40% of them are distributed free, unconditionally, to all users, and that is called the entitlement. And 1 year's supply of units is distributed to all users, and that is a rolling year. That is to say, at the end of 1 week, it's topped up with another week. And so we always have 1 year's supply of energy units, electronic energy units in our pockets, so to speak, at all times. The rest is distributed in a different way, but it's an entirely uncreative scheme. I haven't invented a single thing here because I don't have any imagination. And it applies something called the tender, and as I'm sure you know, the treasury bills and government debt are distributed every week by the government. It's something called the tender, and banks and 35 banks and brokers distribute, bid for these instruments, and then distribute them to their various clients in a very, very simple electronic way. And that is a very simple thing. So the whole, every energy user in the economy has their allowance of units, and every time they buy energy, they surrender units. Right, well, I'm now going to sort of show you one or two of the sort of key things. One of the first thing I'm going to show you is the budget. That is the fundamental thing. At the in the first year, there is a certain quantity of TEQs units distributed, which is not very far different from the quantity that actually used at that time anyway. I mean, just at the very moment of announcing that this is going to happen, should the government actually ever do this, there will be something which economists like to know as the, I don't know why they call it this, but there you go, it's called the announcement effect. And it actually means that when the government announces something, people actually assume it's already happened and they sort of take action. So just the process of announcing this is going to happen will immediately get people to do quite a lot of things by way of energy saving. So that the budget can be set in quite a stiff budget. That's the first thing I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you the budget and how it works, very briefly. It's two very simple little pictures. And then I'm going to show you the market and how that works. But that's over on the computer. I'm going to have to move this off again. So, sorry. Right. Sorry, those are the cows again. You've seen that, right? Yes. Well, there, as promised, that is a picture of the TEQs budget, and it's a forecast. It's set over 20 years, except I've only shown 15 years of that because I thought you can imagine the last 5. But it's in groups of periods of 3. There's a commitment, which is it's a binding budget. Then it's a more or less binding budget called the intention, and then it's a forecast which goes on for the following 20 years, and which is a pretty simple diagram, isn't it, actually? And this is how it rolls along. In next year, you see the first year is used up, and another year is added towards the end. And what's exciting about that is actually more exciting than it looks, because in fact it gives everybody a chance to plan ahead. I imagine you're in the first year. There'll be no problem. I mean, all you have to do is just change your light bulbs. So I'm sure everybody in this room has already done that. Or whatever the next thing is to change your light bulbs. So decide to go and see your mother-in-law slightly less often than you do at the moment. A few, or maybe that'd be too contentious. But anyways, a few fairly simple things like that. But then what it tells you is that in 20 years' time, 15 years' time, then 20 years' time, the problem is going to be very fierce indeed. And so you're actually going to need to think very hard indeed about what to do. And actually that budget is going to have to go down so fast, you're going to have to think very hard indeed, and you will start off by not having the slightest clue what to do, because nobody has the slightest clue about how to cope within 20 years with a very substantially reduced budget, apart from bearing in mind the three criteria of lean energy which I've outlined. But it's okay to outline these things in theory, but actually doing them in practice is another matter. So what I'm saying is you will need to do two things. One is you will need to work with each other as a local community in ways of how to do this, because most of these things are only possible if they're done at the level of the locality. You can't do them as individuals. So you really, I'm sure in Totnes you do talk to each other already. You'll be talking to each other even more than you do at the moment. And other communities where they don't talk to each other will have to start doing so. There will be a real sense of community, common purpose. And the second thing you will need, obviously, I say you will need to do, it sounds a bit authoritarian, I don't mean that at all, but anyway, to say that anyway, you will need to do is to imply your ingenuity and intelligence. And that is something which, unfortunately, I think has tended to sort of drop out of the scene for quite a lot, for a few years since the end of the Second World War. It's almost regarded as not politically correct to think, particularly politically correct to think about something which actually makes a difference. Broadly, it was forecast by the sociologist Emil Durkheim some time ago that we're becoming a more and more managerial society, that is to say that there are various bureaucrats who tell you what to do. And one of the first things you've got to do is to stop thinking, well, TEQs are a framework which is only possible to survive if you think. Okay, so that's a budget. I think you've probably seen that long enough. I'm now going to make that clear by showing you a picture of the market. I suppose I could have from there, couldn't I? Couldn't I? This is better. Until this works. Yes, it does. Right. How's that? Okay. You're now about to see a picture of the market for tradable energy quotas. And it begins in the middle with something called the Energy Policy Committee. I told this it was a non-creative, non-imaginative scheme, in that that's a direct sort of copy of the Monetary Policy Committee, an independent policy committee, independent of the government, that actually is paid to use their intelligence and expertise to set a budget and set, not interest rates, but set the carbon budget. And that is the core of the scheme. And one of the crucial points about this, it means that the government is actually not part of this scheme in a direct way. So it's removed from the political process. It does give the government something much more important to do, which I shall come to in a minute. But essentially it's a hands-off, clean scheme in which the Energy Policy Committee is in charge. And then that sets the carbon budget, as you see, which is what I've already explained. And then above the carbon budget, there's something called the Quota Co, which is a sort of a name which is for the registrar. And the registrar, in effect, there'll no doubt be an office attached, but essentially it's a large computer. It's a large computer database, which is exactly the same kind of database which has been used for many, many years in managing investment trusts, and investment funds and unit trusts and things like that, and pension funds. So the technology is already there, just a little bit bigger than the ones that they've used so far. And then what the Quota Co does is it issues units, and it issues units in something that's called the issue. I like to keep things simple here. And then in two parts, as described before, 40% is in the entitlement and 60% is a tender. And below me, that all goes down into one market, except if there is a trading market there, which in fact would be very similar, in fact, if not almost identical, to markets that already exist. Everybody's involved, anybody can trade in the market, that feels like it. And someone gets some money out of it, namely the government gets some money out of it, and they can actually, you see that money, that pound sign coming down on the bottom left-hand corner, if you look carefully, that's money going into the government's pocket. I just want to say that again, the money going into the government's pocket to be used for good purposes, such as helping us actually to reduce our energy demand. And then it flows. So this is the other non-creative thing about this. It is based on something very exciting called the value-added tax system, which is based on value-added, and this is carbon-added, so it just flows around in exactly the same way as carbon value-added systems, and then it flows up through those various stages. What I can't read them at the moment. Yes, I hope I can't read my own chart. Right, yes, yeah, to the fuel and electricity retailers and wholesalers and fuel extractors. That is to say, I didn't really need to read it, actually. I knew it anyway. I mean, the thing is, when you go to a petrol station, you buy the petrol and you surrender money. I mean, you give over the money, and then you also give over your units. And then those units go up through to the wholesaler, and then they go up to the refiners, and then finally they go back to the company that took the oil out of the ground in the first place, or the company that exported it, and they're surrendered then finally back to the, oh gosh, I didn't mean to do that, finally back to, oh dear, oh, these technologies things are so difficult. Anyway, finally then they're surrendered back into Quotaco, and so it closes the loop. Well, that's really all there is to say about that, actually. It's a very simple system. I should actually say one or two little things about it, because I tell you one thing about tradable energy quotas. It's actually, I think it's very rather bad for your personality. People there is a phenomenon which I've noticed for quite a long time. If something's got a fairly descriptive title, then people think, well, that's all I need to know about it, really. I don't need to read a book about it or find out any more about it. All I need, the title is enough. And small is beautiful. I was talking to the students about this yesterday. Small is beautiful is a fine example. It says on the title, small is beautiful. I mean, who needs to read the book? That's all you really need to know. Small things being beautiful. I mean, it saves us so much time not to have to read the book. And tradable energy quotas are very like that, really. You know they're tradable, and they know about energy, and you know their quotas, and that's really all you need to know. And then, of course, when you need to do that, you go to sleep and you think, oh, that doesn't work very well. He's got that wrong, he's got that wrong, and then you reinvent it. And, practically everywhere. I think I probably converted about sort of 30,000 people altogether about the joys of tradable energy quotas. And what that really means is 30,000 different versions of tradable energy quotas, and none of them agree. And so when the government sort of says, what about these tradable energy quotas? Everyone says, oh, I know what they are, and I know what they are. So the government's getting 30,000 different messages, and getting a little bit lost about this. For this reason, I'm going to outline very quickly, sort of 5 points, or maybe a few more, but roughly 5 points about it. Number one is a guarantee that the energy budget will be achieved, a guarantee. There's no way of not achieving the budget. Number two, it gives one time actually to achieve the results, which are the very difficult results that are needed. Number three, it doesn't remove doesn't remove money from the economy. So it leaves money in the hands of the people who are going to need money, sometimes a great deal of money, and sometimes involving a loss of income in what's happening. So it leaves money in the economy. Number four, which is absolutely essential, is that it's a form of rationing. Rationing is actually a good thing. It guarantees that people will get access to the rations they need. And if they don't get access to the rations they need, they're in trouble. So all forms of versions of text which are going around about transferring money to people, that makes no difference at all, because if the rich actually have more money one way or another, then they can get all the energy that's going away. It has to be a ration, a direct ration, defined in terms of the good itself rather than in terms of money. Number five, how many up to? 5? Roughly. Thank you very much. I was once talking to the Liberal Democrats without a glass of water next to me. And your tongue and mouth goes completely dry. I can't understand. And that was the end of that, really. But terrible. So that explains. Yeah, number 5 is Thomas. Sorry about this autobiography. I'm getting back to the point now. Number 5 is the hands-off scheme, which is that there's been lots of stuff about how the public will need to be educated, which sounds pretty patronizing to me. Anyway, that's what they say about how to use it. Actually, the public, whoever they are, will hardly need to be educated, whatever that is, in it, because the whole thing is done by card and by direct debit, and they'll be barely aware of using it. All they'll be aware of actually is the reality of the budget going down, and the reality that they really are going to have to work together very, very much indeed, to get their energy consumption down. So it's a hands-off scheme. Number 6 is that the government at last has a useful job to do, for goodness sake. And that job is enabling us to achieve that budget, because the government will have a moral authority to do this, because the government itself is going to be having to work within the budget. They're going to have to buy every little bit of unit, all the units they need. The Army and Navy are going to have to buy units. Hospitals, everybody, even Prime Ministerial cars driving all the way from Downing Street to the House of Commons. We're going to have to buy units to do this. So they'll be in deep trouble, as you can see, and they'll be feeling the pain. And because they'll be feeling the pain, they'll know the pain we feel, and therefore they will have to help us, and they will actually have a positive job. They will have the carrots. It's a carbon policy committee which will have the stick. A clear division between carrot and stick. A clear criterion for good systems for systems thinking. The government's going to have this effective job to do. And then number 7. I'm sorry, there are more than 6. Well, number 7. It is something that can be done unilaterally. People say, oh, we can't do this because it'll stop us being competitive. I don't care very much about being competitive, but a lot of other people should do, so I should go through the motions of caring about being competitive. If one actually were, it's ludicrous to imagine that we wouldn't be able to do so because the European Union would obviously have to do it at the same time. If, as a series of national schemes, but we'll come back to this, but if the UK were the first in, and the only one to do this, just think of the competitive advantage we would have. We would develop tremendously competitive industries. Our export trade in terms of energy saving would absolutely rocket. Our demand for energy per unit of output would crash. We'd have the moral authority and leadership of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, we would be off to the races. Unfortunately, it's not going to be as good as that, because I have no doubt that when we do it, other people will be doing it at the moment. And actually, the more realistic and the positive thing, which is just about marginally possible, I wouldn't put it higher than that, is that it would be a European coordinated scheme. Now, this is absolutely crucial. It is not, absolutely not, an international scheme. It would not work as an international scheme. It's a national scheme. I will say this again, ladies and gentlemen, it's a national scheme, and if it's worked on a European-wide basis, then that's a European-wide coordinated basis with every European nation working on a national basis within the European-wide framework. So every Europe would have different budgets working on different criteria in different languages with different budgets, different governments giving it different approaches. There would be what is absolutely essential to good system thinking. There would be diversity and there would be modularity. The principle is, my mantra for the moment, if one wants to do a big task, you don't set up a large system to do it. You set up small systems to do it, working within a large structure. That is essential. Large-scale tasks need small-scale systems working within a large coordinating structure. Right. My last observation about tradable energy quotas before going on to the next topic is something called pull. Something called pull. I can't. Sorry, not my fault, Gov. It's just this technology that doesn't like me. Anyway, this thing, I think you know what I mean now. The word, you've got the word, yes. Well, this comes from something which I won't go into in any detail. It's called lean thinking, which is a form of management thinking which was developed in that well-known source of inspiration to us Greens, which is the Toyota motor industry in Japan of 1940s and 1950s. They developed a scheme, to cut a long story short, which actually is so well organized and so well defined that it's more or less obvious that if anything goes wrong, that anything happens on the production line, it's more or less obvious to the people on the production line what needs to be done about it. So you don't need to have a lot of heavy-duty managers pointing at the problem and telling people to get on with it and doing the thinking for them. The workers are actually not only required but encouraged and enabled to think and actually apply their own ingenuity. So it's a bottom-up scheme within a top-down framework. Guess what? This is exactly how systems should work. So, in fact, it's a non-authoritarian scheme which requires, I think the point that I came in on, it requires people to work together and apply their intelligence and ingenuity to achieve it. That's a bit of an abrupt ending to tradable energy quotas, but that's all I'm going to say about that, and I'm going to move on to the next thing, which again was turning this off, I think. Yes, it does. Right. Now, you may think this had nothing to do with what I've just been talking about but it actually is central to it, and you will see the connection very soon. One of the things that's going on at the moment, of course, one of the things everybody recognizes going on, it's an entirely uncontroversial thing. Maybe the only uncontroversial thing I would say is that we do consume an enormous number of goods, a vast quantity, a most prodigious quantity of goods. You may wonder why we do produce this, and then we can also divide the quantity of goods, this huge quantity of goods, into two groups. One is the goods you enjoy consuming. The other goods, the goods you don't particularly enjoy consuming. You hardly know you do, but you've got to because there ain't no choice. And the goods you enjoy are sort of things like food and shirts and toothpaste, dinners out, things like that. The things you don't particularly enjoy are things such as the police force and transport systems and mechanics and people to get rid of sewage and the barges that go down the Thames to dump rubbish in various places. I never know where they go, but presumably somewhere it goes. Those sorts of things. And there's two different sort of kinds of goods. And there are no particularly good names for those kinds of goods. I've been studying economics for a long time, and there are three names which kind of more or less circle around the problem. But someone may contradict me on this, but economics doesn't really recognize that these goods exist. The three names that are widely used in economics are regrettable necessities, which is quite a good name, invented by Robert and Nancy Ruggles in 1960. And then there's something called defensive expenditure, which I needn't tell you about, which takes a long, long time. It's a 10-week course on defensive expenditure, but it's very simple, really. And the third one is intermediate goods, and none of these really actually get it, but the intermediate goods is the closest thing. And what intermediate goods are, as I mean them, is this. I've got a definition of intermediate goods, which I will now show you. Right. Oh, I'm doing this, not sure. Okay, intermediate goods are things which are necessary given the size and structure that we happen to have at the moment, but are regrettable in that we don't actually get any pleasure from them. If a way could be found of getting along without them, we would be better off. Well, I don't know about you, but whenever I'm confronted by a definition, my brain switches off. I really haven't the slightest clue what they mean. So I'm going to explain something about this. And in order to do that, I'm going to say something about size. Size is a funny thing. Well, the scale is the better word. Scale is a funny thing. One tends to think that a large-scale something is a kind of large-scale version of a small thing, but actually it isn't. I hope that makes sense to you. But I'll now explain what this does actually mean. Is that if you scale something up, you don't end up with just a bigger version of what you started with. You end up with something which is qualitatively different. And the person who pointed this out was J.B.S. Haldane, the great scientist, and the guys were times when guys were great and allowed to smoke pipes in their official portraits in 1927. And he wrote this wonderful article called On Being the Right Size, which explains the difficulty of being an elephant. Actually, the difficulty of being anything bigger than a slug, really, or a centipede. I mean, as soon as you start really getting that ambitious, then you start having to sort of invent ways of respiring and breathing, because slugs can breathe through their skin, and if you can't breathe through your skin, you've got to think of another way of doing it. And lungs is one of the solutions for this, and they're very, very complicated, and they're very extensive, and a huge amount of surface area. And then you also have to get rid of heat, otherwise you sort of get overheated and melt. And one way of doing that is your metabolism has to slow down, and you can end up by being so slow you get sort of dopey and get attacked by predators and things like that. So, or you need big ears. I mean, there are lots of ways around these things. But elephants have got big ears. I'm told that's one of the reasons why elephants do have big ears. But on the other hand, I don't know. Anyway, however, he also pointed out, one of the things that size does matter. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why we are the size we are. I mean, if we were very much smaller, for example, much, much smaller, you can imagine it'd be very difficult for us to handle fire, because it would have to be, the fires don't come that small, and well, they do, but you can't boil any porridge on them, And if you're very, very big, I mean, a fire is big enough to boil any porridge if you're a very big person. It would have to be a sort of conflagration, you burn the place down. So it's a very good thing we are the size we are, because fire is manageable. And also things such as the size of our bones. If we're much bigger, we'd have to have enormous sort of legs like an elephant, which would be difficult. Well, it wouldn't be much different from my athletic performance, really. But that's another story. But nonetheless, and also it actually means we fall down less dramatically, because our children, you can see them running ahead, and then sometimes before you know where they are, they're on the flat on their face screaming before you've even seen them fall. Whereas because we're fairly tall, we have a sort of slow rate of topple. So it's easier to stay upright. Whereas if you're much taller, we wouldn't tall very much, but we'd have a small fall very much. We'd have even a slower rate of topple. But if we did fall, we'd break every rib in our body, and it'd be bad thing. So for a lot of reasons, size is rather crucial. One has to get the size right. Well, I'm actually talking about intermediate goods here. And well, the reason we have having intermediate goods is because we're so big. And if we weren't so big, we would actually just be allowed to let our sewage fall into the local river, and it would be also dissolved into pure water a mile downstream, and we wouldn't have to, it'd be very easy to run closed systems. And we wouldn't have to have a police force, because people would be looking out of the window all the time just to make sure nobody was doing any harm, and they get smacked over the wrist. If they did, and if we were very, very small, we'd be allowed to smack people over the wrist, because there wouldn't be the European Union, because they wouldn't be, because we'd be small. So, okay, there are lots of... So, what I'm really saying is, intermediate goods exist because we're very large, and in fact, I think maybe this is a good moment to actually give you an illustration of what intermediate goods are, otherwise you think I'm being theoretical. And as you know, really, this is meant to be, the title of this is a practical guide to the energy descent, and so I will now give you a practical illustration of intermediate goods. This is probably the most boring list that you've ever seen in your life, which is why I've got to read it. Not only that, but it'll be followed by a list which is even more boring. So if you are feeling sleepy, now is the moment just to drop off for a little bit. I'm now going to read out two lists with percentages. Right. Oh, no, I'm not. Okay, intermediate goods. These are goods. I have to say that it's very hard actually to break out intermediate goods from non-intermediate goods, because they don't sort of break off cleanly. I mean, of a loaf of bread, a lot of intermediate good in a loaf of bread, but it's travelled a long way. But actually the bread bit is okay, you don't really need the packaging. So the thing is, just bear in mind that, not all of these are pure intermediate goods. They're kind of sort of mixed up, but there are lots of intermediate good in all this, particularly in government expenditure. Okay, well, Social Security, I told you this is going to be boring. 31% of government expenditure is Social Security. 17% is health. I'm going to go relentlessly right through this list, so you have been warned. 17% is health and social services. Oh, I can do this with this one, of course. Education, 13%. Defence is 8%. Law and order, 5%. Transport, 3%. And the rest is 13%, which is housing and urban, other local services, central government, management, finance, employment and training, industry and science, environmental management, international relations, heritage and leisure, and finally the debt interest, reserves and adjustments. Now the point is, the reason I'm telling you this is because here we are talking about localization, we're talking about doing things for ourselves. We actually have to realize all the things we're actually going to be doing without, because when energy problem hits, when it hits, these systems will fail. And these are the goods that we consume. We're going to have to think of other ways of supplying these. Food, non-alcoholic drinks, housing, motoring, leisure services, household goods, clothing and footwear, leisure goods, household services, alcoholic drinks, personal goods and services, fuel and power, fares, travel costs and tobacco. Now, it's sort of getting real, really. These are the things that are supplied at the moment, and if we didn't have them, we would be in trouble. I'm going to give you some examples of intermediate goods in other societies. And one list of intermediate goods is described by an archaeologist called Colin Renfrew, Lord Renfrew, who is a wonderful man who describes how a society might be sort of, such as a Celtic Stone Age society, might be sort of carrying along, chuntering along absolutely fine, no problem at all, until they realize there are actually a few more people around, and so there actually is a slightly bigger demand for pots, things to drink out of than they thought. But the thing is that just at that time, all the pots are being made by the local. It's the peas, isn't it? Yeah. I'm going to be saying an awful lot about pots, so we're going to have. I can't think of a solution to this. Anyway, this is the situation. So anyway, the farmers are making these pots, and every time they make the pots, they have to start up their stoves, and they have to get the clay, and they have to remind themselves how to do it, and it's all rather slow and inefficient. And it's not really working very well, and the quality of pots they're producing is not very good. And so, well, they say very, very reasonable. Well, why don't we actually have some of us actually specialising in making pots and forgetting about the farming? So they think that's a very, very good idea. So they do. So they set up some specialist pot makers. And as we know from having read our Adam Smith, that if you set out specialists to do something, rather than having sort of a generalist doing the whole thing, you end up with an increase of productivity. I think he said 4,166 times as productive as you were before, something like that. Anyway, so that's what they do. And but then of course there is a trouble. But if you find if all the pots are being made by specialists, then that means they're not being made locally. In which case you have to have roads to carry them around, and you have got to have wagons and things like that. And then you have a tax to pay for the roads, which is quite reasonable, of course. You can't have roads without tax, really. Then you have to have administrators to administer the tax. And then, of course, the minister's got to live somewhere, so they have to live in towns. And then there are end up with more jobs in towns, and because administrators need people to work with, because they're just administrating tax, they can't do anything else, they can't cook or grow food or anything, so they need other people to work in towns. So population of towns arises, and then this begins to upset the social structure of the countryside, and so sexual routines isn't the right word, but sexual arrangements have changed, and so birth control systems begin to decline, so the population begins to rise. It's all because you want these pots, but anyway, and then you've got now. So the population rises, and then once the population has risen, then you actually need more food. So you say, well, that's okay. There are lots and lots of people around now. So you actually make an army, and you invade the neighbour, and you get the food, and actually you also get a lot of other things. And you become very rich, and things are going very well. And the result of it is that you need more pots. So it starts again. And all those things in that list, except the pots at the beginning and end, they all consist entirely of intermediate goods. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is one illustration of how intermediate goods occur. And the result of that, you get something which Colin Renfrew describes, which is nucleation. I'm going to show you what nucleation means. You actually already had a preview of it, which I didn't mean to show you, but I'll show you the real thing now, I think. Oh, no. How do you turn back? Oh, I know, you use this thing, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry about that. There we are. Right, sorry about how difficult that seemed to be. But anyway, that is not my diagram, it's Colin Renfrew's diagram of nucleation. And you begin with a pre-pot society, and you begin with lots of villages, kind of the little totnesses, little Robin Hopkins around the place. Those little dots on the left are places with Robin Hopkins in control, and people like him. But I'm going to see the place on the right is quite different. It's called nucleation, and you end up with actually fewer rural settlements, and some very large towns, and some absolutely enormous towns. And clearly, in enormous towns like that, you need authoritarian emperors and people like that to run it. So the whole thing becomes quite expensive to run, and you need lots of intermediate goods. And I think that story is quite satisfactory, but if something's satisfactory, the best thing to do is to add to it. And I'll tell you two more stories, but come to more or less the same conclusion, if that's all right. One is by a lady called Esther Boserup, who describes the development of agriculture. And you begin with hunting and gathering, which is a very, very energy efficient way of carrying on. You end up with you have a lot of free time. But then if you end up, am I running short of time? If you need more, I've got lots more to say. If you need more food, I will speed up. If you need more food, then okay, right, well you start felling some trees. It's called swidden agriculture, and it's very efficient because the trees leave behind, unless they're conifers, wherever Stefan is. I can't see him. There he is. Not conifers. I'm not talking about conifers. Anyway, if you fell trees, non-conifers, you end up with a very fertile soil, and you can grow food without very much trouble. Because one thing is that it's in the middle of the forest. The weeds can't get there, so there's no weeding to do. Lots and lots of food product. And output. And when the soil starts getting exhausted, then you just move on somewhere else. And that's absolutely fine. Then you don't do that a little bit too often. Then you actually have to come back more quickly, and that's called bush fallow. And that's more difficult because you start having to do some weeding then, and quite a lot more energy and work has to go into it. So at every stage you end up with more work going into it, more food, but much, much more work, and it becomes much more efficient. You have to get up early, and instead of working for just 2 hours a day as a hunter and gatherer, you start having to work for 6 hours a day. Then it goes up further to short fallow, in which you have to come back to it so quickly that there's grass there, and if there's grass there, then it's very difficult to dig up. You need to have that, you need to plough it, and if you need to plough it, you need oxen, and you need to breed the oxen, and you need to keep the oxen in and build fences all over the place. And then if they're your oxen, you need to have people looking after it. And then you have to have laws to ensure that everybody knows whose oxen they are. And then you go on to annual cropping, which is incredibly hard work, and then to multiple cropping, which is even harder work. All these stages, they do produce more food, but actually they take a hell of a lot more intermediate goods. And we must quickly move on from intermediate goods, otherwise I'll run out of time. I want to give you the last illustration of this point, which I rather like, by a guy called Richard Wilkinson, who is much disliked by economists, which is a very good thing in his favour. And he describes the process of intermediate goods in the case of coal mining. I mean, it began in the wonderful days when we didn't need to use coal, though coal had been used for a long time. Essentially, we lived on wood, which is very easy to carry around. It's very clean, and it burns cleanly, and the smoke is delicious. And you can grow it in your garden and sit around it. But coal from shallow mines is more or less okay. You have to try and transport it a long way, and it starts getting a little bit dangerous, and it's very dirty, and the smoke is toxic. But that's nothing like as much trouble as it is when you start getting coal from deep mines, and you start going into the intermediate good business in a very, very serious way indeed. You've got to get pumps, and you've got to invent steam engines and things, and then you've got to, once you've cracked that, you've got to build transport systems of 3 times over, roads which work, and then they don't work because they get rutted. Then you have to build canals, and they don't work because they're not fast enough. Then you have to build railways, and then you have to build towns, result of which you end up by building an enormous civilization, all because you're getting short of wood. Now, I'm now going to say, let us suppose that owing to the oil peak, and owing to action on climate change, owing to all the straws in the wind I began by talking about, that our entire intermediate economy crashes, and we don't have any intermediate goods any longer, and that we're looking towards that diagram picture on the right with these Hopkins-led rural economies, relocalized economies, the process of relocalization. And we are trying to live in an economy in which the intermediate economy doesn't work any longer. What would we do? Well, I'm not going to take you through that entire list, but there actually are 1 or 2 elements on the list which might be worth taking you through, if that's all right. Supposing the first thing is social security systems. As I'm sure you remember, 31% of government expenditure on social security systems. So in one's localized economy, one has a lot of unemployed people, one has a lot of old people, and they need social security systems, but the government has no money with which to pay them, and one needs to provide for these people oneself. Well, that's trouble. And I'm not saying that all there are easy solutions to any of these. One has to take the trouble on the chin as well as the solutions. Poor law is one of the long term. Another ground base in English history has been the poor laws, and there's been always a contest between villages, between the rural village economies, to get rid of their poor and to shove them on to the next parish. And Queen Elizabeth had trouble, and there was trouble before, and there's been trouble ever since. However, there are some things one needs to look at the bright side, and the purpose of my talk this evening is to cheer you all up. One is recognize that there are a lot of things going in our favour. That is to say, the villages will be much, much more located. People will be living at home. People will be living at home. There would be probably more extended families. The cost of living will be much lower. There will be quite a lot that one can do for the unemployed and for one's elderly relations. So there are some things that can be done in the context of social security. What about health? What do we do about that, if there you are in your rural economy? Well, there are some good things one could say about that too. Quite a lot of things on our favour. One thing one's not likely to have is a lot of obesity. So that will save some trouble. And probably there will be no junk food. One's diet to be a lot better. We'll be back to a diets like the Robert McClance and with the Widdowson diet of the war, which is the most healthy diet there's been in modern times. You may very well find the degenerative diseases, the cancer and the arthritis and the osteoporosis and the coronary disease, they wouldn't disappear by any means, but they would probably be much less prevalent than they have been. There would be less, the cost of health would be reduced. So there would in fact be, people would be taking more exercise. People would probably be smoking less, I would imagine. It'd be hard to get tobacco under those circumstances. There is no such thing as a society so poor that it can't afford to produce its own alcohol out of potatoes or something even worse. So I can't necessarily say that alcohol would be sorted, but if Rob Hopkins was in control, I can imagine that people would be, ways would be found of preventing people getting drunk. So there are ways that, but also the other thing one has to say is that social capital would be very much developed. And one of the things which is very, very good for one's health is having friends. If you're well connected with friends, with friends and family, your chance of dying over the next 5 years is reduced by between half and 5 times. 5 times less likely to die over the next 5 years if you've got lots of friends and families around. And if you haven't got any friends and family, but you decide to join a group of some kind, your chance of dying over the next 1 year is reduced by half. So we'd be a highly sort of socialized society, and that would help to keep us healthy. So there may well be much less disease. So that would be something in our favour. There'd be other things in our favour too. One thing we would not have would be delocalized hospitals. There would have to be localized hospitals. There'd be no way of getting to Exeter, the nearest hospital, if that is your nearest hospital. There would have to be local hospitals. There would probably be fewer specialism. There would be, at long last, a recovery, a serious encouragement of voluntarism. There would be voluntary help in hospitals, as there used to be in the past, and will be again, and there isn't now. And there would be hope that it is possible to run small local schools and produce absolutely spectacular consequences, results in education, reading and music and art and thought and constructiveness and niceness, that nice quality that nice people can have and many people don't. It can be done in local school. If you think of the other things that communities can do, one, they can teach the art, they can teach farming, they can teach masonry. They used to teach how to make a wagon. Rob, I'm getting carried away here. I think you ought to make sure I don't go on too long. I've got a lot of really... Oh no, you're kidding. May I have your permission to go on a little bit longer? I haven't got to the point yet. Oh no, much more than that. Well, look, I'll negotiate. I'm going to have a lot of eye contact with Rob, and I shall do terrible things to him if he interrupts me. I want to get on something which is really, really important. Actually, the whole point of this is still to come. I really do tell you, but oh dear. Well, how much can I cut out of what I'm going to say? Well, I will actually quickly say, I mean, that the teaching of crafts in community is the most spectacular thing, and I would recommend, if anybody hasn't read it, you read George Sturt's The Wheelwright Shop, and it describes, for one thing, the most wonderful thing about how they make wheels, and the men who have to drive the spokes into a hub. It's like they're sort of the Barenboims of carpentry. There would be the hub, and there were these spokes, and they would pick up this sledgehammer, and then with a leap, hit this spoke right in the middle, and it would stay there for the next 200 years. And it would be impossible to teach anybody that unless they start at the age of 12. And here's Gordon Brown saying they ought to keep them at school until 18. So the things that communities can do, which are fundamental. I'm now cutting out a lot of really good stuff, and it's your fault, guys, right? Oh, there's just one more thing I want to say on education. I'm going to leave other things I was going to say on community education, but there is something to say about higher education. I mean, are we talking about a future in which there's no higher education any longer? Well, it would be a pity if that did happen. But you know, As a Conservative minister said under the Thatcher government, not all that long ago, we have taken money from the people who write about ancient Egyptian scripts and about the prenuptial habits of the upper Volta Valley in order to give them to technical education. Any society which has a Minister of Education that says that doesn't deserve to have any education system at all. It's like tickling a dog's stomach. They do not know what higher education is for. At the moment, we to a large extent don't have higher education, but there have been times in the past when higher education has been produced very, very successfully on very, very little money indeed, which is very, very local. For example, the Workers' Education Association, started in the late 19th century, Albert Manbridge, had spectacular results. And I've got actually at home, I've got the archive of some of the education which happened in Horwich Literary Society. And Horwich is a very small engineering town, at least was a very small engineering town. They made very famous Horwich tank engines and steam locomotives, and they had the Literary Society met on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the Railway Mechanics Institute. And Mr. David Gibson was the manager of the Horwich Loco Works, and he was also a very, very good tenor. I used to sing to them on Tuesdays. Other people sang too, it wasn't just him every Tuesday, I want to say, but nonetheless. And also there were lectures on Thursdays about various literary topics, and he was enthusiastic about Thomas Carlyle, and gave them a lecture on poetry, which, as lectures should do, makes a connection between what he's talking about and the locality. And I have a quote from him here, but I'll read out. I'm sorry, I've got to go through all that. We're getting there. There we are. Poetry teaches us to see beauty all around us. We see it in Horwich, we see it in the windy streets with the old smoke-blackened houses with their decent fronts on a clear east windy day. We see it when we look down on the Black Rod and Horwich Valley with its houses and factories. The gleams of water in the lodges. We may even find this beauty in the poetic interpretation of it in some of our big stately locomotives. Well, if I heard that lecture and that enthusiasm and that emotion and that passion and that connection in any modern university, English course in modern university, I'd be impressed. So there are things the localities can do on education. Defence, there are lots of things to say about defence, but under the eye of Rob, I'm going to leave defence on one side. It is the most difficult one anyway. On law and order, what does one do about law and order? Well, law and order was cracked to a large extent in the past. We tend to underestimate the accomplishment of the medieval Gothic civilization. One of the reasons we underestimate that is because it was purged, almost all evidence of it was purged in the Reformation, with the exception of the cathedrals, which should give us some idea about how effective it was. They didn't have a police force. Will we be able to afford a police force? The answer is no. Well, they couldn't then either. But they had an alternative. The Statute of Winchester in 1285 defined the police function of every male in the village. Every male had, from the age of 15 to 60, had to go around armed. The knights would have to wear hauberk, which was a coat of mail and a sword. The poor men have a bow and arrow and a knife. When the church bell rang, they'd have to take part in the hue and cry. It was their responsibility to keep the road verges free of vegetation, of trees, so the robbers couldn't hide behind them. And they had to take part in something called a posse comitatus, where if the Scots or neighbours got seriously uppy, they had to go out and sort them out. We now use posse in the context of the drug gangs of Boston, Mass. So they did have an effect. They did have a police force. It worked. It was an amateur police force. As far as crime detection was concerned, that was more problematic. They didn't really know very much about it. Very hard to know who did something and imagine a terrible deed, and how do you get? And everybody's denying doing it. Well, they had something called compurgators, which is a jury that would get together to say who they thought done it. It wasn't very effective. They used to back this up with giving them tests, such as putting a pebble at the bottom of a boiling cauldron and getting someone to pick the pebble out. And if their blister was bad enough, then it showed they were guilty. Or grasping a red-hot iron, or walking over red-hot coals. One wouldn't necessarily recommend these procedures in localities. But we don't need to do so, because in many, many ways we actually are now becoming technologically capable of localization in a way no civilization has ever been able to do before. The fact that we're localized doesn't mean we don't have access to DNA technology. We don't have access to the modern detection techniques. It doesn't mean that we won't have an amateur police force capable of taking part in this. Indeed, we will do this. Suddenly, the citizen as an active participant in the society will become crucial again. All these things can be done. And the last thing I should say about that is that magistrates, we inherit their brilliant system of magistrates, which came after 1066, after the conquest. They existed informally for 300 years before they were finally established in the 14th century. And we had them a really thriving, wonderful system of magistrates, capable of preserving the peace and of keeping the society in order, until about 10 years ago when the Labour government started dismantling it in its process of centralisation and delocalisation. There are still magistrates, and may even be magistrates here. But on the whole, they're being centralised towards large towns, and localities are losing control of their law and order. And they're being sort of taken over by the servants as stipendiary magistrates. So to a large extent, the magistracy is disappearing. That can be recovered. And then the last one we can look at is transport. In the case in the future, A, we won't be able to have transport because of the reason we discussed, and B, we will be developing local self-sufficiency. So will we need transport? No, we won't. Can one really imagine our road system being discarded, being abandoned? Well, indeed, it's happened twice before. The Roman road system was discarded. And then in 1837, we used to have the most wonderful transport system of the turnpikes, 20,000 miles of turnpikes, dual carriageway, 30 yards across. In 1842, they were empty, crucified by the railways. The grass started going across them. They never recovered. So there are things that can be done. Okay, right, now I'm going to get to the point of what I really want to say, which is, if we're going to do all this, we're really going to show that localization can work in practice. We need to build communities around which can make them work. And this is very, very difficult, but nobody is talking about this, and I find it very difficult myself to talk about, because it's just not in the vocabulary, not in the mind, it's not well planted there, because it's sort of new stuff, and I'm still very unfamiliar with it. I feel a little bit I was walking over hot coals. But a community is a group in a particular place. A community is a group in a particular place in which interactions and loyalties snake through the whole thing like well-tossed spaghetti. It's a grammar. It's a grammar of community. It's a common inheritance. It's a humour and good faith which identify a community and give it existence. Well, that's what a community is. So let us actually sort of see what happens, how this applies. Now, there are different sorts of community, and the depth of obligation depends absolutely on the size of the community. Deep obligations exist in very small groups, in families of 5 to 12 people. Less deep obligations, but nonetheless crucial ones, exist in the next scale size up, which is 150. That is the group, that is the society, the essential size of group which will need to work in the future as a cooperative unit. That ain't me speaking, that is a huge literature on the scale of a group which is large enough to be effective, but small enough actually to be cooperative. It's 150. However big the community should be, it should recognize that it's the groups of 150 that are the groups that matter. Above that, there are larger groups which can be more or less any size you want. One could call them the parish. And above that, there is a nation. And they all have different forms of reciprocity, whose names are so long, I better not tell you what they are, because I'd run out of time. But if one's going to do that, then one will need a culture. And one needs to recognize that culture is going to have a central job to do. Right. Well, culture is, I think the best thing is to give a metaphor. It's like the upright strands that you begin with when you're making a basket, round which you wind the texture of the basket itself. It actually is the culture which is the grammar. And a lot of the culture and a lot of the texture of the community which I'm talking about, in fact, is inherited. Much of the culture which works in a community building sense is not something which we do because we like to do it, but because we've inherited. And the person who explains this best is the philosopher Edmund Burke. And I'm going to read out to you what he said about it. Oh yes, I should have ended up with that. I was in such a hurry. Can I just go back to Ivan Illich on transport? Can I just forget about needing transport, concentrate on space? Ivan Illich said, what we need to think about is space that offers to each person a constantly renewed experience, that the center of the world is a place where he stands, walks, and lives. You can't put it better than that, really. Anyway, what I really wanted to show you was Edmund Burke. Much the strongest moral obligations are such as were never the result of our option, wrote Burke in an appeal from the new to the old Whigs. Men without their choice derived benefits from that association. Without their choice, they are subjected to duties in consequence of these benefits. Without their choice, they enter into a virtual obligation as binding as any that is actual. So culture, to a very large extent, and the way the communities work, is to a very large extent something we inherit, and we have to actually hang on to everything we possibly can, all the cultural inheritance we have got. Okay, anyway, we know what culture is now, and now I'm coming to my concluding part of what I'm going to say. I'm actually getting to the point now, and let's actually say what culture does. What does culture actually do? Why do we need it? Well, it does three things. Thing number one is it provides social cohesion. That is to say, social cohesion is a difference between a group, a cooperative group, and a crowd of individuals that are indifferent to each other or actually hostile to each other. And that's really all one needs to say about cohesion, actually. Except that how is cohesion expressed? You don't say, here we are all being jolly cohesive together. How it's actually expressed is it's in culture. Cohesion is expressed in music, in choirs, in going to choir practice, in doing things which are cultural together, which are not cloying together, which actually have cultural integrity and cultural accomplishment together. And the second thing that the culture does, it develops a public sphere, and not many people are talking about a public sphere either. And the public sphere is something which exists, which you take part in when you are expressing yourself in a community, not as yourself. That is to say, you're no longer thinking about your problems and about why it is that your compost loo doesn't work, and about how difficult neighbours are, and what you'll do with the apples, and who is stealing your cabbages, and things like that, and generally the mechanics of how to cope. We're actually saying, okay, enough of all that, maybe we'll come back to that tomorrow, but let's now raise our thoughts to higher things. So, in the public sphere, that is to say, you are not just expressing yourself as you are, you're not being, in the modern sense, authentic. You're actually doing something, you're taking part in something which you know in the literature as self-distance. You're saying, don't look at me, don't think just about me. I'm not coming here as me, I'm coming here as a member of the community. And to some extent, in fact to a very large extent, that the absence of the public sphere is expressed in the modern age by the fact that people aren't dressing properly. I don't want to become moralistic and ranty about dress. That's not my purpose at all. But one of the reasons, in fact, the justification for when you go to parties as in Islington, as one does, every bloke looking as though he's a plumber, every woman looking as though she's brought a plumber. In some cases, they probably have. You never know. But clothes are sort of not the thing. The way to express oneself, the self-distance, is to do something really silly, like wear a bow tie, something with absolutely no practical value at all. It makes you look a little bit daft. public expression requires something which is not of practical value. The public sphere has no direct practical value. It is direct as cultural expression. That's the first thing that happens in the public sphere. And I think it's actually worthwhile saying that there is a question of demoralization here. One of the reasons why the public sphere is no longer recognized, is no longer expressed, is because people have become demoralized. Who cares less? Nobody cares really about the public sphere any longer. What is the public sphere? Nobody has any idea. Maybe you have little idea what I'm talking about in terms of the public sphere. It's just not part of our experience. Young people would have no clue. But it's a matter of demoralization. That is what's happening. We no longer think we belong to a public sphere. It matters any longer. So when one's actually talking about relocalization, we're talking about remoralization as well. The two, relocalization and remoralization, are the same things. It's actually saying your locality matters, and it matters more than in practical terms, it matters in cultural terms as well. And in that context, it is possible to play. Play has been fundamental to every resilient, long-lasting civilization. These villages I was telling you about, which we need to recover if we're going to keep the DNA of human society going. They need to have a culture of play. I'm getting very near the end now. What does play do? Play is such a relief because it means you can get very, very close to somebody, and we will need to get very, very close to people in the future, in the community of the future. But if you get that close, it can be a little bit terrifying. You don't want to be all that close to people. And come on, that you can take these things too far. In the context of play, there's also distance. So you establish your difference and your separate identity in the context of play. And this is well recognized in the play literature. You get very close with people, and you agree to be adversarial with them. So you're establishing your difference, and at the same time you're colluding in this common activity. And that is a way of bonding. It's very hard to bond with anybody effectively without play. Without play, it just becomes sort of cloying or nasty, or you just fall apart. And it's also very good for your body because it releases serotonin, and if we deprive the serotonin, then you are likely to be involved in a drug addiction, violence, tantrums, withdrawal, depression, and boredom. Sounds like everybody's idea of a teenager. Could be something to do with that. Maybe they lack serotonin. So, very near the end, promise. That's the second thing the public sphere does. And the third thing the public sphere does, it develops practice, and practice is an idea which was described by Alistair McIntyre, which is accomplishment in an artistic skill, such as playing the piano, or being very good at something very difficult. And I was talking about this yesterday, but some people will be familiar with what I'm about to say. However, Alistair McIntyre developed the idea that if you are very good at something like, let's say playing the piano, or whatever it may be, the three moral qualities are developed in you. Number one is truthfulness, because there's no possibility of you actually knowing, reaching a level of accomplishment without actually having some sense of truth or falsehood. You can judge your own performance. The second is fairness or justice. You can judge other people's performance. And the third is culture. The third is courage, because you're always slightly going beyond what you've ever done before. You're always testing your limits. And those three, if ever one wanted us a package of moral qualities, those are the three which one can package properly. Those are the three things which come from the public, from accomplishment. So that's what public sphere does. And now the last thing that culture does, which is then I will really stop talking, is that it develops something which may be the most fundamental thing of all, which is judgment. We're suffering from a depletion of oil, we're suffering from a depletion of many things, and above all, we're suffering from a depletion of good judgment. We seem to have lost the ability to think. We're digging the hole deeper and deeper with every public decision that's made, and probably bad judgment is spilling over into personal judgment as well. So the question is, how does culture develop judgment? Well, it develops it in the following way. Number one, it establishes your identity, because if you are accomplished in a culture, you take part in your community's culture, then that gives you the identity. And therefore, if you have an identity, you know what you're making a judgment about. If you don't have any identity, there is no way in which reason actually makes any sense at all. There are some areas of life, such as Euclidean geometry, in which a sort of free-ranging rationality exists, whether there's anybody around to know it or not. but actually in most of the circumstances of our lives, we have to have an identity before reason makes any sense at all. And the illustration of that, you imagine an antelope being chased by a lion. The antelope's reason says, I need to run away from this lion. And the lion's reason says, I need to chase this antelope. And those reasons are both right, but they're all entirely based on, related to, founded on the identity of said antelope and lion. And it is actually becoming not rhetoric, is not hyperbole to say that in our society, in our failing society, we are losing our sense of identity to such an extent we are losing our ability to reason because we don't know who we are any longer. The second thing, which is related to that, is that if you have established your identity by your involvement or participation in culture, you can actually get rid, you actually in command of your own identity. You don't have to prove anything. If you don't have to prove anything, you can come to a problem without any baggage. You don't have to come to every problem in order with a particular agenda. And you can take case-by-case judgments. And that, I'm glad to say, ladies and gentlemen, takes us back to that wonderful period. I don't want to exaggerate how wonderful it was. It had problems as well. It had good qualities as well. The medieval period in which they developed this property of making case-by-case judgments. And they made a lot out of it. It was just one of the few things that kept Christendom together, that there has to do with the integrity of being able to, of not approaching things in a big, catch-all scientific way, but actually looking at the person in the eye and saying exactly what are the circumstances that are going on here. That later came to be called casuistry. And needless to say, as science began to come on stream in the 17th century, it began to be rubbished. And Blaise Pascal rubbished it in his Lettres Provinciales in 1656 in a polemic of such absolute savagery that casuistry has been a term of abuse ever since. And from since then, philosophers have been earning an enormous amount of money, which is entirely undeserved, developing broad philosophical principles in terms of which to make that. So that's the third. My last, he's making the most fearful signs at me, for which he will suffer later. I have about 5 more sentences. Would you like to hear my last 5 sentences then? You see, right. I hope I've explained to you why, if we're going to join together and make a future, the first thing we need to do is to go after choir practice. I kid you not, it's parody. It is the bit that's been forgotten about. It's the culture that comes first. Indeed, we do have to find ways of swapping vegetables and developing renewable energy systems and doing such very difficult things and making ourselves self-sufficient. And those things are very difficult and absolutely essential. They're non-negotiable. And thank goodness we are doing it. But that's not what it's about. What it's really about is starting now to build localities that ring with creative vitality and which we can call home. Thank you.